Hello and welcome to this week's Top Tip Tuesday. And this week we are working with watercolour pencils. I've got both of our sets of watercolour pencils in just one of our stamp cases, which you can order these on at my online store, and the link to that is below. They fit beautifully, so both sets, and you can get a blender brush in there as well, and they just fit in there perfectly. So blender brush, blender pen, I mean. I have marked my pencils just with a bit of washi tape to show whether they're in the first collection or the second. If they've got washi tape, they're in the second collection. That's purely so that when I'm filming videos, I know if I'm sticking to one or other pencil collection. Obviously, you don't need to worry about that. You can have them however you want. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the paper on which we're going to do the samples. So I've got ordinary basic white, I've got shimmery white, and I've got the Fluid 100 watercolour paper. I've also got some black that I'm going to be using, which may sound a bit odd. And yes, I'm using the Catch You Later stamp set. I'm actually using this image throughout, just so that we've got some continuity. Now, each of these papers have their benefits, but they are slightly different colours. So we've got the watercolour, the Fluid 100 watercolour paper is more of a vanilla. Let me bring in. So this is very vanilla. You can see that this is quite vanilla. Then we've got the Shimmer White, which is a little whiter, and then we've obviously got the basic white, which is a bright white. So you do need to bear in mind the colour that you're working on when you're using watercolour pencils, because they become translucent. Although they are pigment, because that's basically the colour in the watercolour pencil is pigment, when you start moving them round, they will become more translucent. As far as which is the best one to use, it really is a question of what you're going to do. What I would say, now I've got some of our water painters here. If I was using just water, it doesn't really go sort of work with the paper. It just goes straight in, and eventually this is what happens. You get effectively papier-mâché. It's a nasty looking result, and one that we don't really want to go with. So do bear that in mind. If you get your basic white paper, and that's the same for both the thick and the smooth, it's not attractive if you get it too wet. The same can happen with your blender brush, because this has a liquid in. So if I rub, again, I'm getting this pilling. So it's breaking down the fibres of the paper. So do bear that in mind when you're doing your colouring. You don't want anything to be too wet. And I do generally talk about that when I'm using watercolour pencils. On this Shimmer White, you can really get going quite well with your blender brush. It will eventually pill, but much longer before it does that. And again, with the water painter, you can really get things going quite nicely. The water sits on the surface better than it does on the standard paper. But again, if you keep going over one place too much, it will eventually break down the fibres of the paper, which is not a look we want. Watercolour paper, so the Fluid 100, the whole idea with this is that you get it wet. So you can get it nice and wet, and it's going to both sit on the paper but also absorb into the paper. Don't know why it's got a dirty mark on the back, but you can really go to town with your water. I would be less tempted to use your blender brush, purely because it's a rougher paper and your blender brush is better on smooth. It will work, and we will look at that. So I have already stamped and prepared 6 images. So I've got basic black that I've heat embossed with white embossing powder. This one I've put the white, the Whisper White crayon or watercolour pencil, they're not crayons, all over the background, and I will explain why in a moment. This, oh no, I have got two of these. So these I've stamped on just the basic white. These are on Shimmer White, and this is on Watercolour. In all of the black stamping, I have used StazOn. You can use Memento, but it will, if you use it immediately, Memento is water resistant, but only when it's actually dry. If you're using your blender brush, if it's really dry, the stamped image, you can use your blender brush, but you may get a little bit of smudging. So StazOn is better. I'm a lazy stamper, so I do tend to use Memento a little bit more where I perhaps shouldn't. So let me start with, actually no, I'm going to start with the ordinary white, and I'm going to grab, what I really want is Balmy Blue. So Balmy Blue, I'm just laying down some colour. You want to use the edge of your pencil more than the point. Ideally you don't want what I've got, which is a really sharp point, because you may end up with it being a bit scratchy. So it may you may end up with lines where you don't want them. Now you can use your pencils just as pencils. You don't have to use them with a liquid, but I'm going to show you how you use them with a liquid. Basic grey, again, it's a bit sharp, but I'm just going to, avoiding his eyes, I'm just going to add some colour to the background here. And I'm using the edge rather than the point. And now the more pigment you lay down, the darker your image will be when you blend. So for shading, for example, I'm going to want this to be darker. So I'm going to put more pigment down at the bottom. And then we'll come up his tail. You don't have to add pigment everywhere. Now, I'm going to want some grey here, but I'm not actually going to use my pencil at the moment. I'm going to have a goldfish because it's easy, and again, this is a bit of a sharp point, but I do want quite a lot of pigment, and a sharp point is better if you want lots of pigment. So this is my basic coloured image. If I come in with my blender brush, this is a relatively new brush, so it's got a nice clean end to it. I always scribble with my blender brush before I go into my project, but this is a new one, so I'm going to just brush backwards and forwards without going over one area too much. If I do want to go over one area again and again, I will wait for it to dry and then go back. So we're going to come down here, and then I'm going to do his tail next. Like that. So that's what we've got so far. So it's a much smoother image. And then if I come in and do this bit down at the bottom where we've got extra pigment, hopefully you can see that we've got a darker image. And then I want grey here because we're looking through glass, but it's still going to be grey. Some of the pigment has stayed on here. Otherwise, I can pick it up off my pencil and lay it down that way, so I get a very soft result. Can you see? And then scribble. I can come in with onto my Balmy Blue, which is quite blue for Balmy Blue, but this is a cartoon character, so I'm happy to have a somewhat bluer blue than you would actually have. Now I'm going to scribble that so I get the blue off and then come in and move round the pigment for my goldfish. And that is my finished result. Just to show you that I've still got colour on that nib, that is why you want to scribble it off. Now, if I do the same sort of thing on my next one, so I'm going to lay my colour down. Gone into his eye a bit, but never mind. So I'm going to lay my colour down. I'm actually adding a bit more colour this time. I'm pressing harder. That's not important. And I'm actually not going to colour the whole image, but I am going to do a bit of the blue and the orange. And I'm going to bring in a piece of just kitchen paper, absorbent paper, and my water brush, my water painter, and just make sure that's running, which it is. Now, if I come in here with my water brush, that's going quite nicely, but if I get it too wet, as I showed you at the beginning, we are going to start, as I move this around, the fibres on the paper are beginning to pill. I can see that that's happening. So that's one thing to bear in mind. The other thing is that you can, if you're not careful, end up with your colours running, because it's not as easy to control a water painter than it is a pen. So this is beginning to run. And if I come back and want to, so if I wanted to smooth that out, so I've got orange there, no, I want to blend that out. So I'm going to blend and blend and blend, and it's happening. The watercolour, the paper is not liking all this water, so it's breaking down. So that's basic white. If you want to use basic white, use your blender pen and you'll get a nice finish. Now, shimmer white, that's the word I'm looking for. Again, I'm not going to colour the whole image because I think you've got the idea of the basic, how you smooth this out. So there's my grey, come in with some blue and some orange, so pumpkin pie and balmy blue. And again, if I come in with my blender pen, I always check, even if I know I've just used it. Now this works really nicely. Really nicely, and you can move that ink around, the pencil ink around really well. And again, we've got that nice control. And because this is a smoother paper that is meant to have water on it, I mean not lashings of water, but meant to have water on it, it doesn't break down quite as quickly. It's beginning to break down, but not quite as badly as the white. And then the orange. Again, we've got a nice smooth finish. If I do the same thing with the shimmer and water, so pumpkin pie, balmy blue, and I am putting quite a lot of pigment down, basic grey. Let's come in with our water painter, make sure it's running clear. Now this is giving me quite a lot of pigment to play with, so I can move that around quite nicely. And again, because it's meant to have take a little bit more water than the basic white, I can go over the same area a bit. Don't want to go mad. And again, we can come in, blend it out. And you don't have to use a water painter, you could use just a paintbrush and water. I do like the water painters because you have a bit more control, because you've got that water in the barrel. And it feeds a gentle flow of water rather than masses, which you can get with a paintbrush. So there we go, we've got that nice finish. So Shimmer White, beautiful. Now, watercolour paper. So again, let's lay down some colour. And for this, I definitely wouldn't put colour everywhere. I would on my fish more because it's small, but on watercolour paper, you don't need to be quite so concerned about where the pigment's going. And this is why. Now, I've already said I wouldn't use the blender pen on watercolour paper because it's not what it's meant for. Let's go in and start with our gold, or orange in this case. Now, I'm going to wait for that to dry. Won't take long. Clean off my brush, and I'm going to come in and move this around. And for this, I can almost use where I've got more pigment as a palette for my ink, because it doesn't mind having lots of water. So I can take my pigment from here and I can get a really nice smooth ombre effect. So I've got pale colour at the top, moving down, and that is as much as anything because of the paper. Because the paper is allowing me to add more water without pilling. So clean that off, and now I can come into the blue. Because the orange is now dry, there's less of a concern that I'm going to get a muddy colour between my orange and my blue. But can you see, hopefully I'll bring this up in a moment, that I can bring that colour down, and even though I didn't have pencil here, I've managed to bring the colour right down. So if I show you that again, and I'll use the blue because it's a really nice colour to do it with, so I'm going to lay that blue down on my watercolour, on my Fluid 100 paper, and add lots of water to it, and I can fade this down. And I can keep adding water and it really won't mind. So I can have that lovely faded background, which is great for backgrounds. So if you wanted a background round your cat, you could have that lovely watercolour background just with a little bit of ink, a little bit of the pencil at the top, and just fade it down. So you can do that to an extent on the Shimmer White. So this is the back of the previous piece. So let me add that. Not quite as much, but you can. So add my water and fade it down. This is going to show the outline of your original a little bit more. You do need to kind of work that a bit more, but again we're getting that nice watercolour finish. But if I do that on my ordinary white, if I add water water to that, it doesn't really bring the colour down. All it does is smush it just blends here, but it doesn't bring the colour down. So that's white card. Now, if we go to black, I'm going to show you this first. So this is black card with white here, and then pigment, the colours over the top. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my blender pen, and the first thing I'm going to do is go over this. So this is yellow with white behind and not. Pacific Point with white behind and not. Bermuda Bay, the same. Pumpkin Pie. Melon Mambo. And can you see that here it's effectively lifted the colour straight off? So it's almost like I haven't bothered putting it down. If I do the same with my water painter, that gives me a bit of colour, but not much. And on this side, we get this nice opaque pastel colour. Now I'm using far too much water just for speed. But can you see that here we've kept the colour because we've got the white? It is still just about here, but not nearly as well. So we can bring in this one, which I've put white on top, on already rather, add, so this is heat embossed in white embossing powder. If I add my orange over the top, come in with my blender pen and dab rather than brush, I can get a little build-up of colour. Now I'm being quite hard on myself by using black as my background. Something like soft suede is beautiful using this technique. So there we've got some colour. I'm doing this really quickly. I'll use the other end of my... But if I do it this side with just the pencil, you can hardly see the colour, and if I then blend it out, it's almost like I haven't bothered. So other than where it's on the embossing powder, let me just buff that. So other than where it's on the embossing powder, needn't have bothered, as opposed to with the white behind, you have got that hint, and the more layers you build up, the more colour will come through. So there you are, using your watercolour pencils. They are a great medium to use, please don't think they're not. So you can use them just with your blender pen, you can use them just as coloured pencils. So much to do. This is one of my favourite techniques, using it on watercolour paper, because you get this lovely, easy to control watercolour effect. It works well on the Shimmer White. On the white, blender pen please only. If you start going in with your water painter, you're going to break the fibres down. So Shimmer White, you can use either. Watercolour, just water, and on this one, just the blender pen. That's it from me. That's my husband telling me it's lunchtime, so I'll say goodbye. Thank you very much indeed for watching. If you've enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye!